So maybe while we wait, I'll just give you kind of some background about Rebuild by Design. We put together this panel. Rebuild by Design was founded after Hurricane Sandy, founded by the federal government. And the federal government set aside $1 billion and created a design competition called Rebuild by Design that connected worldwide experts with communities on the ground and local governments to design large-scale changes to our thinking. We're there. To our infrastructure. I just want to make sure they can hear. Also, I see. I put this is off. So you know.
Okay. Yeah.
And we have about 7 projects that are being implemented in the region now. Originally, HUD awarded $930 million to those projects that have over $4 billion in the region. And we've continued on with the same type of process that we did during post-Sandy work for resilience work, pre-resilience work. So we do it in a couple of ways. We do large-scale design competitions, which I mentioned to you. We do engagements with cities around the world, and then we do research and policy. And this comes out of our research and policy work because we think it's really important to get ahead of some of these issues. For most decisions that happen in climate change, it's usually post-disaster. And things are happening very fast, and people are asked, being confronted with these questions: should I move? Should I not move? What will happen when your finances are already in disarray and your life is in disarray, and it's really hard? So what we're trying to do here is talk about the effects of climate change on New York City, specifically on displacement, where we have the space to plan for it ahead of time. And I think that that's really the most important thing. So we have been working with Milliman, and we'll introduce Molly Barth in a second. And we together will be presenting on climate displacement maps that are not yet released, but looking forward in kind of the in the spirit of, if the city were to do nothing and have no interventions, what would happen to our communities? And then we will also be joined by other colleagues who are working on similar work. So we have Sheila Foster. Actually, I should introduce all of them at the same time. So we'll have Marley Barth. There we go. Great. We have Molly Barth, who is a GIS professional with Milliman, an international actuarial consulting firm. She works out of San Francisco property and casualty practice, and her work focuses on capturing geospatial indicators of hazard risk to support insurance pricing and climate resiliency planning. And she has been doing all the mapping work with us. And then Sheila Foster is going to present her work. And she is the Scott K. Ginsberg Professor of Urban Law and Policy at Georgetown University. And she's jointly appointed to the law school and the public policy school. And she has sat on the New York City panel of climate change. And then lastly, we will be joined by Francesca Ortega, who's an expertise in economics of migration and climate change. He has an economics PhD from NYU, and he is the Dina Axelrod Perry Professor in economics at CUNY Queens College. So first, I'll make sure everyone who's joining us online, can you see and hear? Okay. Okay. Can you actually also see who's in the audience, or you know that view?
We can't. I can't see the audience. I can see you.
One second. Okay. We couldn't hear you, Molly. Say it again, please. Now our audio is working.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we're good, right?
Perfect.
Can you guys all hear? Yeah. Okay, we probably have about 30 people in the room. Everybody is pushed together, kind of, pre-COVID days. And awesome. Molly, would you prefer if we advance the slides, or would you like to?
I don't know how to advance the slides.
You're good. I got
So
it.
I'll just say next slide. Perfect.
Let's kick it off with Molly.
Okay, well, I'll jump right in. So yes, Amy just introduced me. My name is Molly. I work at Milliman, and I'm a GIS analyst there. I work out of the San Francisco property and casualty practice. So a lot of my day-to-day work is spent building geospatial models to inform home insurance pricing, particularly in flood and wildfire insurance. But I also get to spend a lot of my time doing research via the Milliman Climate Resilience Initiative. So we take on various research topics and have that capacity to explore them. And when Amy and Johanna from Rebuild by Design reached out earlier this year to work on some displacement maps for New York City, I was pretty excited because a lot of my work is kind of done in a silo. And it's been great to work with them. They live in New York. They are really tuned into the challenges that the city's going through and what people on the ground are experiencing. And I'm from San Francisco, so very much unfamiliar with New York, and having their perspectives has really shaped the research process and the things that we're looking at. So next slide, please. So our main research objective was to understand how future coastal flooding brought on by sea level rise and extreme weather events could impact New York City neighborhoods and cause displacement of residents from not only the physical threats of stormwater moving in, but also from the social and financial threats of people around the city moving to different areas to either escape the floodwaters or because other people are moving in from coastal areas to the inland areas. So we wanted to understand how the socioeconomic makeup of the city could change as climate change worsens, and then just add to that growing body of knowledge that to help the city plan ahead to allow people across the economic spectrum to have the best possible options as these changes worsen. So next slide, please. So the study that I'm sharing today, it's really pretty simple. And I like that it's simple because it's easy to convey. We understand that there are a lot of limitations to our approach here, but what I really like is that it's easy to convey and it's easy to understand. So effectively, we wanted to know, where is storm surge flooding going to impact the city? What neighborhoods are going to be affected? Who lives in those neighborhoods? And where might they go? So we used a combination of data from the New York City Panel on Climate Change's latest report in 2019, the estimates of the future floodplain. We chose 2050 as the year to look at because that's within a lot of our lifespans, and it's a very real year for us. They also have projections from 2080 and 2100, which seem a lot more distant to us today. And 2050 is quite on the horizon. So we chose to look at 2050. We use census data, so census block group boundaries. Those are groups of census blocks, so fairly granular geography. We use data from the American Community Survey, also out of the US Census, to look at demographics. And then we segregated the city into 4 distinct quadrants. And I'll get into what those quadrants are as we look through the results. Now, next slide, please. So the first step in the process here was to identify which census block groups could be impacted by future storm surge flooding. And so just to preface, we're not also looking at inland rainfall flooding and stormwater flooding. This is just focused on coastal storm surge, both in part due to keeping it simple, let's focus on one thing at a time, and also the data availability. We found that this is just let's start here and let's see what we're getting at. So back one slide. So in that map, in this map here, we can see that I've outlined census block groups that have residential housing units in them. I've outlined them in dark black if they are within the extent of that 2050 floodplain, and those that are just a lighter gray are outside of the extent of the 2050 estimated floodplain. This is from the New York City Panel on Climate Change. And we determined that if any portion of the block group was within that estimated floodplain, we considered it impacted by flooding. That's because if there is flooding in the local area, maybe it's not exactly at someone's home, but that's going to impact their ability to get to work, to get to the grocery store, to get to other services. So we felt that it was important to include any block group where any portion was within the floodplain. Next slide, please. So the next step was to identify the city's lowest income block groups. So here we see a map of the top most impoverished block groups. I use data on the number of households living at or below the poverty level by block group. And so these are the dark green block groups are the top 25% most impoverished block groups, which also happens to be block groups where at least 25% of households are living at or below the poverty level. So it's just a binary yes, no flag. So we have a yes, no flag as to if the block group is going to be, is estimated to be experiencing flooding in 2050, and a yes, no flag, is this a very impoverished block group? The next slide, please. And then I went about segregating the city into these 4 displacement quadrants. So again, this is a very simplified model, a very simple way to think about displacement from flood and where people are moving, if they're moving at all. So we have stable populations. Those are folks with more income living in lower flood risk areas. We have emigrating populations. These are people with more financial means who have the means to move, and they're currently living in those coastal high risk areas. We have crisis areas. These are lower income people living inland, so living on higher ground with lower flood risk. I'm sorry, crisis areas are people living in high flood risk areas along the coast. And then destination areas are lower income areas. These are the inland areas where there is currently lower flood risk. So we would assume that destination areas could be at risk for displacement. They're currently predicted to have a lower flood risk in the future, and people from emigrating areas might be able to have the means to move in and displace residents from these destination areas. So next slide, please. So this is what our displacement map looks like. And the map is, the map is flashy, it's really cool, but what we really wanted to know more about is who makes up these various components of the city, who is living in these areas, these crisis areas where there's a lot of flood risk and it's primarily occupied by lower income people. Who's living in the destination areas? What type of people are going to be emigrating? So next slide, please. So I downloaded and aggregated additional census data by the block group level and then brought it all together at the quadrant level. So things like households living below poverty and mean household income, well, we know those were kind of baked into that initial assignment, right? But things like race and housing unit type and home ownership, those were not a part of our initial assignment. So this table, I think, really illustrates some interesting things. So the crisis areas are primarily people of color living in rented units, rented multifamily units. The destination areas are majority people of color living in rented multifamily units, while the emigrating and stable populations are majority white people living in owned single family homes, right? So there's quite a disparity between each quadrant here. And I do want to add, like, having the notes here, this is not evaluating storm surge or storm water flooding and extreme rain. So while we've labeled areas destination, right, those areas could still be at risk for other types of flooding and other types of climate disasters. But for the purposes of this, these are likely areas that could be at lower risk for storm surge flooding. And I've got the median rents here. These rents are from the census. They represent kind of the lowest median rents. They might seem low compared to what you would expect. That's because the census data is actually capped at $3,500, and it kind of has that $3,500 and up range. But we could see that the destination and crisis areas have much lower rents than the emigrating and stable areas. So it's likely that people emigrating from the coast could come into the displacement areas, the destination areas, have the financial means to price out folks who have been there for a long time. And the people living in the crisis areas, they might not have a lot of options, and this can be a really important group for the city to focus on as they plan for the future. Next slide, please. So I've left several of the takeaways that we just discussed on the slide, just kind of to have it in the slide deck. Again, I'm not from New York, so I've been learning a lot about the neighborhoods, but so I left some of the neighborhoods that I was noticing that are within each of these different areas. And of course, it's not like everybody living in an emigrating block group is wealthy, or that everyone living in a crisis area is of lower income. These are just kind of broad scale, big picture takeaways. Okay, last slide, please. And, you know, here we are, we're at the 10-year Hurricane Sandy anniversary event. So I wanted to think about comparing the results we shared here to what happened in Hurricane Sandy. And I'm showing the inundation extent from Hurricane Sandy in darker blue, and that same 2050 estimated floodplain from the New York City panel on climate change in that bright turquoise. And as we can see, the 2050 floodplain extends much further inland than even Hurricane Sandy hit. So we know that Sandy destroyed about 70,000 housing units in New York City. And we, on our work, we estimate that 800,000 housing units are currently within that 2050 floodplain. So what lessons have we learned from Sandy in planning that we can bring forward into this future floodplain area to, again, give people the best options ahead of time? So that is all for me. I'm really excited to hear what the other panelists have to share.
Thank you. We're now turn it over to Sheila Foster. Thank you so much for joining us.
Sure. And I'm really here to talk about the work of the equity work group of the New York Panel on Climate Change, and to present the work that we're doing with Dr. Marco Tedesco, who's in the audience there. Just by way of background, I've been on the NPCC for the last 2 rounds of the panel, and in both cases, co-chairing the equity work group. And the first iteration of our work, which ended up in a report published in 2019, really framed climate equity in terms of 3 factors. One is distributive equity, the second procedural, and the third contextual equity. And what we did was, as part of the first prong, looked at the social vulnerability mapping indices that were available and tried to adapt them to New York City and to offer the city guidance for how to track the rise and fall of social vulnerability across New York City in terms of its adaptation work. There's a lot more to that report, but this second time around on equity, we're looking a little deeper into not just social vulnerability, but climate displacement. There's no one data set that captures what we're trying to do, but a really good start is the CEPHR data set that Dr. Tedesco has developed, and he can talk about that in the Q&A. But what we thought we'd do today was to just give an overview of the kinds of data we're trying to capture when we talk about climate displacement. There's a backdrop to this, which is to say that there's a lot of literature and existing studies looking at forms of displacement, and we distinguish between direct displacement, which is to say the displacement that comes from climate shocks, and indirect displacement that is a result of resiliency investments, or what some people call environmental gentrification. We're avoiding the term gentrification because many people think that a lot of these communities that are impacted enjoy the amenities of gentrification and just don't want to be displaced. So that's what we're focused on. Next slide. So what I'm going to talk through, if we go to the next slide.
I'm going to just ask you to explain the NYPCC for some folks.
Yes.
The relationship to government.
Sure. So the New York Panel on Climate Change was first impaneled, and I think that Klaus is in the room, and he's one of the original members, was first impaneled by Mayor Bloomberg, I think in 2008 and then re-impaneled after Sandy, was impaneled again under de Blasio. And that was the first time I sat on it, which had a focus in part on equity. And so it's the fourth iteration of it, NPCC 4. And the panel is the expert body that advises the mayor's office and brings the best science, both climate science and social science in terms of risk to the city from climate change, risk to infrastructure, flooding risk, heat risk. And then now, of course, we've been looking at how equity intersects with those risks. So it is one of the bodies or one input into the mayor's office of, now it's the mayor's office of climate justice, I believe. So it's an expertise body. All right, so what we pulled together for today to try to give an overview of what we're looking at and what we're going to dig a bit deeper into is the intersection between, obviously, displacement and flood risk. So go to the next slide, please, and I will break down these maps. So here, for instance, what we see is data from the mayor's office on displacement and data from FEMA's National Risk Index on coastal flood, and then on risk in general, which includes climate and social vulnerability. And the thing here to focus on, obviously, is where displacement is the highest at the top left, where the percentage of non-white populations are, sorry, on the bottom left. And then to compare that to where the greater both coastal flood risk, but also risk more generally, again, looking at climate and sociability factors. So next slide will highlight some of this. Okay, so here we see obviously the two data points from the mayor's office that the highest displacement risk is also overlaps fairly significantly with the percentage of non-white population. Next slide. And then if you look at the displacement risk and the FEMA risk, again, significant overlap in particular, and I'll return to this at the end of the slide deck, in East Harlem, Southern Brooklyn, I'm sorry, Southern Manhattan on the east side, and then in Southern Brooklyn here. Next slide. And here is a description of what we've seen, which is to say that that the mean percentage of obviously non-white people increases strongly with displacement, meaning that the areas at high risk of displacement are populated by a large majority of non-white people. At the same time, areas with low displacement are characterized by a low percentage of non-white people. So that's the city maps. And then if comparing the displacement and FEMA risk maps, that the mean risk increases on that index as we go from places with moderate to higher and highest displacement. So again, next slides, we'll look at this a little deeper. So the last slides are really to look at this area where you see the intersection between the displacement risk and the climate risk. The areas with high risk of displacement intersects with those tracks where the FEMA risk is highest. And again, these are fairly broad windows into this overlap, and our intention is to go a little bit deeper into this to get more granular understanding at the sub-local level, not just at the regional level, so to speak, in the city, but at even the neighborhood level and the block level or the census tract if we can. So that's Southeast Manhattan. Next slide. This is East Harlem. Again, the overlap between the high risk of displacement and the high FEMA risk. And then the last slide is Coney Island, I'm sorry, which is the overlap between, again, higher risk of displacement and the high risk from the FEMA index. So again, just in closing, because I've timed myself and I only had 10 minutes, we're adopting the methodology that Dr. Tedesco has used, in particular in Miami, a recent study of climate displacement in Miami, and also intending to not just use data like this, but, and he can talk about this, machine learning tool, which will allow us to attribute variables or so-called drivers of displacement in, again, hopefully more granular areas. So that's where we are. It's very much, again, a project that's in development. And we're also working with the massive Data Institute at my university at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown, which is helping us with the data analysis. So I'll stop there and we'll welcome at the end Dr. Tedesco to answer any questions about the data.
Thank you. Our last short speaker will be Francesc Ortega, and he comes to us from New College, so a New Yorker. It's always very exciting. Take it away.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, everyone. Amy, you'll be moving down the slides, I understand, right?
Yep.
Okay, so my presentation is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to focus on the economic effects of Sandy, and particularly on the impact that we estimated it had on housing values and business activity. This is work that my collaborators and I have been doing over a number of years. And it's on my list to kind of update it now that we are at the 10-year mark. So some of the results refer to sort of the 6, 7, 8 years after Sandy, but it's due for an update. Next slide, please. Okay, so first I'll give you just a little summary of what we found when we look at the impact of Sandy on housing values. Okay, what we did here is we combined two data sets. We combined the New York City data on all home sales that happen in the city, and we combined that with the FEMA data on damage points. So those data allowed us to identify which individual buildings got flooded or suffered damages during Sandy. And then correlating those two, we could see the evolution of housing values. We had like 3 findings here. Flood zone properties we found that experience a persistent reduction in value, and persistent, we use all the data we had at the time, was 5 years out. Now I would really like to know, and I'll do it soon, to see whether 10 years out the results still are like that. Okay? Now, for properties that actually suffer damage, what we see is they suffer a very large drop in value right after the storm, and then they recover quite rapidly, but the recovery was only a partial recovery. So 5 years out, we saw that their home values remain 8% lower than before Sandy. So this was very interesting because, so the next point, so let me talk about the next point first. So what was also very interesting was that flood zone properties that were not damaged, so they were not directly damaged, but probably disrupted by the flooded roads and maybe electricity dropped and so on and so forth, those properties also experience a reduction in value of about 8%. So even though these properties, this last set of properties, were not damaged, their values have gone down, okay, to the same level as it has converged to the same level as the properties that were damaged. Once they were fixed up, then they also experienced this reduction. So our interpretation is that really Sandy changed beliefs regarding flood risk. And before, people thought people were aware of some risk, but really Sandy changed their perceptions. And this could explain why we found a persistent, maybe permanent reduction in in people's demand for housing in those areas. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, when we did that analysis, one question that we also wanted to look at was what happened with local businesses. Okay? So we used again the data, the damage point data, but this time we linked that to the quarterly census of employment and wages. This is this data contains the universe of business establishments in New York City. And for each establishment, we know the exact location, so we could tell which establishments were affected by Sandy. And in those data, you can see, for instance, the level of employment, also the level of wages for those businesses over time. So we could really redo the same type of analysis, but now from the perspective of business establishments. And what we found was that establishments that were located in blocks that flooded experienced reductions in employment. These reductions were larger and more persistent in areas of Brooklyn and Queens, okay, in the areas that flooded. So 6 years out, we see that the businesses, we see 8% reductions in employment. In Manhattan, we saw smaller drops. Now, here there's a bit of a subtle point that that one needs to be careful and needs to make a distinction between the impact on the company and the impact on the business establishment. Like the establishment is a combination of the company and the actual location. So you will not find typically a persistent negative effect on the company because the company can always change location. So what we really are showing here is that the location, so the actual parcel, that commercial space, after 6 years after Sandy, had lower employment there than it had 6 years earlier. So that could be sometimes that's because the same business establishment has reduced employment, or that company left and it was replaced by another company that is generating less employment. Okay, now we also found that the effects of Sandy on different businesses varied on the basis of the industry. For instance, some industries, if they were involved in reconstruction, contractors and so on, they experience a boon, okay? But others experience a negative effect. We also found a little bit of evidence that some businesses seem to have relocated, some affected businesses relocated. All right, next slide. And now I'd like to tell you about something that's also related to today's talk, but it's not about New York. So I'll be very interested to see what people think in the audience and the other panelists about this type of questions in New York. So in this paper, what we do is we look at population growth at the county and also at the census tract level for the whole US. And we want to ask whether the high risk locations defined either as county or as census tracts, high climate risk locations, are experiencing lower population growth or higher population growth than other areas. Okay, so is there retreat when we look at the whole country? And what we are finding so far is that that's not the case. Okay, we're finding that high risk counties have grown. So over the last 30 years, high-risk counties have grown 3 percentage points more per decade than low-risk counties. Okay, so no retreat. In fact, within counties, we find that the high-risk tracts are growing disproportionately. So not only the counties with higher risk, climate risk, are growing more, but also people are locating in the higher risk tracts within those counties. now all this analysis is based on a composite climate risk index that includes everything. So hurricanes, flood risk, heat waves, so on and so forth. Okay. So far, the work is still ongoing. The pattern that we are finding is similar for the main climate hazards. Okay. So the overall kind of pattern that we're finding is increasing agglomeration in high-risk areas. And when we dig down into this, we see that that's happening particularly in high-risk areas that are dense and have high housing values. Okay? So it suggests that the strong local economy is still having a lot of attraction power, that it beats climate risk concerns. Okay? So now, if this pattern keeps going, then what this says is that we're going to keep seeing record-breaking losses in the economic cost of events. Okay, because we are putting more people and more assets, so to speak, in the high-risk locations. That's all. Thank you.
So we were encouraged very much to have this be a discussion as much as possible. I'm sure you have a lot of questions. But maybe when you do it, you can kind of point to the presenter, but also the audience. Maybe other people can answer them. So, yeah.
Hi, I have a question for Professor Ortega from the National Assessment. And that's whether you looked at the receiving states, particularly the Southeast and the Southwest, whether their tax policies, income taxes and the like, corporate taxes, were the magnets that were causing population to continue to go there, despite the fact that there are climate risks, certainly the Southeast, the weather, flooding and hurricanes, and in the West, a profound drought situation and a profound water loss. If those are factors that were pulling people still in, even though those areas are precarious. And if so, any thoughts you have about that?
Do you mind if I add to your question?
Sure.
Can you also opine on flood insurance or like foul weather insurance rates going up and requirements in counties?
Okay, thank you for the questions. So we can go look at specific areas. I can look at those, but I cannot do it on my head. So we definitely see that. So our first exercise using this data is to just simply look at which counties are, whether high-risk counties are growing more than low-risk counties, and there the answer is yes. And then we try to go a little bit in the direction that you're suggesting, and seeing whether that has to do with sort of state-level policies, okay, or city-level policies. And that seems to that explains part of the effect, but not all, because then we include in our model. So then the second exercise we do is, instead of just looking at population growth in a given county, we look at population growth in the county, netting out the population growth in the commuting zone. So basically in the area around that county. And still we find that high-risk counties are growing more than the commuting zone where they belong to. Okay, so yes, there are state and city level factors, but beyond that, there are also other factors, maybe other amenities that are much more localized than what's going on at the state level or at the city level. And then, so insurance, we haven't looked at that yet in this paper. So far, we're just trying to describe these trends as well as we can. And yeah, so we'll talk about insurance maybe in a bit down the road. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to attempt to turn this into a discussion and put maybe Pamela Pettyjohn on the spot as a Coney Island resident leader in the room. Both our map and Sheila Foster's map had Coney Island as a very, very, very critical place in this conversation. So maybe you could just,
I'd like to answer your question. What has happened is that in New York, we have a housing crisis, which occurred after, well, it's been occurring and getting worse, but especially after 2008. So what the city did was they looked at less dense population. So places like Coney Island was not that densely populated. So these particular areas became prime property for development. But there are also a lot of these less dense communities are also at risk. I mean, we were totally inundated after Sandy, but it was between take the risk or not have the housing. So what they did was they put in policies or you know, for the new development that they had to meet certain requirements for flooding. But what happened was, here's everyone else that's been living there that doesn't have those retrofits. And now all the new buildings that are surrounding us on the waterfront, we don't know exactly what effect that's going to have. But the city was trying to solve two problems at one time. And so we have that, this development is still going on. So we don't know what the end result is going to be. But that was the reason why they started really overdeveloping in such high risk communities.
there's an excellent article in yesterday's The City. It's called The City.nyc is the website. An excellent article, I think, tell me if I'm right, that I think it's 2,000 properties have been built in Coney Island. So it's relatively a small neighborhood, a very, very, as you saw, a very, very risky small neighborhood. 2,000 properties have been built there since Hurricane Sandy.
Luxury and luxury
I was gonna
houses.
say that. And that the rents are completely different. And these are houses that will likely be more safe. Although they may be just in harm, we don't really know.
Well, we don't know how it, the storms are getting more frequent and they're getting stronger. But let me just say on that, they have planned on, it's been okay for 10,000 new units of housing in Coney Island. Coney Island, just in case you don't have never seen it, it's a peninsula. We're surrounded by three sides with water, and there's only 3 avenues of egress. So that's 10,000 new families moving in.
Do you have a sense the new construction that ostensibly is more quote unquote resilient or creates a problem because the adjacent pre-existing structures did not get any assistance from the city to make improvements to harden them or make them resilient, that you create a series of dikes and it actually compounds the problem rather than helps to resolve it?
Well, we had a lot of natural areas that afforded some protection, but with each, with every time there's a wave of development, all of that is destroyed. So now most of it is all concrete over, and you've got all these new buildings. And like I said, to tell you the truth, I don't know what the effect is going to be. I'm not an engineer or an architect, but I can see there's going to be a really big problem because you have these huge buildings right on the waterfront. That the Casamatides is part of that article in The City, and he said that he raised everything up to, it doesn't even start until the 3rd floor. So the first floor is basically like just a way of water flowing through, but no one has said what kind of effect that this is going to have on the rest of the community that was already there. Is it going to be more water? Is this like opening up a dam? Is it going to be like a bathtub now?
Yeah.
So that's something that like I said, I don't have the answers, but it doesn't feel comfortable, I'll tell you. It makes me very, very nervous.
But I also want to add that even if it doesn't have more of an effect, it doesn't matter because Coney Island is so vulnerable. So that population is going to be impacted, maybe impacted more, some percentage, but we might even not know because it's impacted so bad to begin with. I also want to add that the city has done this in, I think it was 6 or 8 neighborhoods where they rezoned and allowed more, 6 to 8 of the most vulnerable neighborhoods, and only 6 or 8, like they took the most vulnerable neighborhoods and they rezoned it to allow for density if the new buildings are raised. However, they haven't invested in the infrastructure for the existing community or the new community. So you can imagine that even if somebody is living in Rockaway in a 10-story building that's raised and their building is not, getting flooded, but the fire department can't get there. The supermarkets are closed. During Hurricane Sandy, Rockaway's access points, which are 2 bridges, were closed for days. So it's not creating a safer environment for anybody. But maybe we could ask somebody else to speak.
Oh, I'm just curious, within the city's regulatory apparatus, do they not conduct comprehensive coastal EIAs prior to large
They do.
development?
They do.
like that?
Of course
They
they
do?
do. Yeah.
And still forecasting oceanographic parameters and changes, and they still approve these?
Yeah.
Okay.
You have a question?
But I just wanted to kind of follow up on what you're saying. The developers doing these high rises have all the equipment to see what the water flow would be at Coney Island. The fact that those reports are not on the table means it has a negative impact, right? So don't you think that this is eventually a push to push out of the current residents in those mid-rises, in the low rises, to probably another part of the city?
Well, Coney has some materials in the same article. He doesn't believe in climate change. He says, yeah, absolutely. It's bonkers. I think what was the word he used, bonkers or something like that. He said, oh, they've been saying that for 40 years. And he's looking to develop even more. He has bought more property. So he's put up 2 buildings and he wants to put up, I think, 3 more. So the developers are, well, I can only quote him because that's what he said in the article. So
I just want to add, a lot of these places have NYCHA, the New York City Public Housing buildings, and they're very, very dense. And developers aren't going to be able to buy those properties. Those people will definitely be there. However, at what risk will they be there and for how long? So that's kind of the question. It's not really like a yes or no, like people's intentions. It's more like what are the rippling effects for what's happening in New York City, even 10 years after what we saw devastation.
I just want to say one thing. Coney Island was hit with a 20-foot surge. We are surrounded by 3 sides. We were totally destroyed. But there has been no investment in infrastructure to protect this community. That's it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, my question is like for Molly, and it's related to this discussion is, could you use the methodology you used for your quadrant, but include like property level data as well, in addition to the census data you use, just to make it, I guess, a bit more granular?
Molly, did you?
Yeah, I'm struggling to hear, but I think the question was, can we incorporate property level data into the quadrant analysis to just understand what's making up these quadrants at a more granular level? Was that the question?
Yes, you got it.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that would be a great next step, and something I did a similar project in Miami-Dade and Broward counties with more of a focus on flood insurance, but we actually did pull in property data, and I think that would be a great expansion on this effort, is to really bring in home values data and understand more about who's purchasing flood insurance, what the availability of housing is in these areas. So yeah, that would be a great next step.
I'd like to ask each of the speakers, if I may, and then we have time, we could ask the audience, what is the one thing that the city can do to address the issues that you raised today? Whoever wants to go first can jump in. All right, Sheila, I'm going to call on you because you are closest to like quote unquote government in your position. So you might have the most sway, but what's the one thing that New York City should be doing right now?
That's a really difficult question, actually. And I hesitate to say something publicly that may not
You have to.
be included in our ultimate report. I mean, I have to say that we are working closely with the city planning department and other offices in the city to come up with an approach that would account for displacement. The city already has an equitable development or tool rather, from which we're drawing data. I think, you know, and it's what's been driving our work for the past couple of rounds here on the NPCC. Better data is something that the city can do to drive its housing and other decisions. And that's what we're trying to develop. I think policy-wise, I mean, obviously housing, everyone knows that we need a better approach to housing, in particular in the highest risk areas. But other than that, I don't have anything specific.
Great, thank you.
If I can add a small comment on that. So I presented the paper I told you about population growth and climate risk at the county level. I presented that in an economics conference a couple of weeks ago, and the reaction was a bit polarized. So some people, like the climate, people doing research in climate change were kind of alarmed by the fact that we see increasing agglomeration in high-risk areas, and that's just creating a bigger public policy problem. But others were sort of putting on their economist hats, where sometimes in the idealized economic models, they pointed out that there is a different interpretation, that maybe the government should not be doing anything, because as long as people are aware of the risks, then if they're going there willingly and they take that into account and so on, maybe the whole thing is efficient. So what should the government do?
Laughing at you, not at you, but at people thinking that that's okay to put people's lives in danger.
So what should the government? What should the government do? Just to finish the sentence. Well, I don't think that we live in that idealized world. So definitely there are policies that maybe the federal government has been doing through the design of the National Flood Insurance Program that for a long time have provided wrong incentives and have made the problem worse. Now, I understand that things are changing and the program is changing, but so that would be the first step. If there is anything that's providing the wrong incentives, maybe we should backtrack on that first.
Okay, lastly, Molly, and we'll have to wrap up after.
Yeah, I mean, I again struggle to think of what the most important or one thing, but kind of to dovetail off what Francesc was saying, yeah, continuing to send the right signals, the right market signals to discourage continued development in these risky areas, so that, you know we have a lot of housing that's at risk in along the coast. Let's at least stop increasing that housing there by sending the right signals via insurance pricing, via building codes, and education, right? A lot of people it's like I work in the insurance industry, and I still struggle to understand a lot of things about how insurance works, and especially how flood insurance works, and the limits, and when you qualify and when you don't qualify. And I think educating people about their options, discouraging continued development in these areas, and making people very aware of the risk via disclosure laws, and education, and targeting communities that are going to be less informed, right? They might not have exposure to these things. So those are kind of my 3 takeaways.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We love having